All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good buddy Chris Faraone. Chris is an independent journalist and news editor at Dig Boston. He is the author of several books, including His Honoroo, I Killed Andrew Breitbart, and 99 Nights with the 99%, all of which you can find at righttopower.net. You can also follow him on Twitter at Faraone. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Excellent. I'm psyched to be here.
All right, so Chris, buddy, about a month ago you were on the show, and we were talking about your ongoing series at Medium called Oregon Tale. It's on the militarized evictions in the state of Oregon and the craziness that surrounds it. It's not just about the evictions. There's so much to this story. We talked about pretty much the first two chapters when you were here about a month ago. In Chapter 3, you actually go into depth on the crazy mortgage scenario of a couple who was evicted by these militarized SWAT teams, and the mortgage stuff is just is the core of this and really is just infuriating and awful. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it because this is one of the few shows where I have the time to really explain what's going on here. It's kind of a nightmare, 25 years in the making for this family. That is the focal point of my story. That's Tom Roach and Melinda Starba. That's the couple, and they're in Southwest Oregon. For those who didn't hear the last time we talked about this, it's extraordinarily rural, and this is a place that relied on logging subsidies for years, for generations, actually. And so people, for example, have never really paid property taxes for services, for basic services, sheriff services, stuff like that. So in 2012, when the federal forest shut down and no more timber, really, to the extent that it used to be, also no more sheriff services on nights and weekends. So things happen to people. Now, that's why it kind of lured me. It was surprising. They don't have any forces, but they're using what they do have to evict people. Also, I should note, to break up, marijuana farms. So basically everything they don't need to be doing. But on top of that, it's not just that they evicted these people. Of course, they're your so-called libertarians and some conservatives say, well, if people just paid their mortgage, well, that's kind of hilarious that anybody would say that after everything we've seen. But all the stuff we saw with the national banks, a lot of that is involved here. But in this token case that I'm really at the focal point of my series of Oregon Tale, these people, this couple's had their house. They've been there since 1990. They've actually paid that principal about 6 times. We're talking 20 years with no problems in making payments. They paid that monthly bill. They live off the grid. They have jobs. But what happened here, it was it's a Wild West mortgage scam. And basically the guy who sold them the deed back in the old days in Oregon in the 90s and the 80s, there were 2 ways to get a loan. You either went to a bank or you went to one of these private trusts. And this guy ripped them off. He had ripped a lot of other people off. His name was Dennis Lloyd. And what happened is, though, after what he was doing, basically a pyramid scheme. I sell you a house, and then I get a bunch of other people. So basically, a bunch of people end up owning that house. Money comes in the bottom, comes out the top, until it doesn't anymore. Nothing original here. Ponzi invented it right here in Boston, where I am. But at the same time, so when the state ended up busting this guy, but when the state busted the guy, they didn't go and help people like Tom and Melinda. They just have like a token number of houses they helped. So all these other people, their house, Tom and Melinda's house, had actually been sold more. I think we're up to counting a dozen times. We found all the old titles. So without them having any idea, just robo signatures, forgeries, you name it. So fast forward almost 25 years when they get evicted by a SWAT team for a number of reasons, including the ones I just note, it just looked sketchy. And it turns out that in Chapter 3, and this is the moment I know you wanted me to get to, is the search warrant isn't even real. You have a 35-page document by a forensic examiner saying the search warrant is false. So, for more than a month now in doing this series, I've known something stinks in Josephine County, that this kind of thing can still be making its way through the courts. Thousands of people are reading about this. I know that there are investigations at certain levels, but not at the local one. So the couple I'm writing about is still facing trespassing charges for being on their own property, still lost their house. This nightmare continues.
Well, I mean, let's get into the search warrant too, because like you mentioned it, but like get into the details, because that again, it just this thing. How corrupt can this actually be? Because it literally is corrupt on every conceivable level, other than the two people who were evicted, who did nothing wrong. And like you said earlier, they paid their mortgage, pretty much 6 times over, and they still get evicted by a SWAT team under a false warrant here. So tell us about it.
So, as for the search warrant, we're still trying to figure out exactly how that happened and who was responsible. I think what's most important to realize, and this is just so critical, is that people, no matter what the banks have done, all that they have done, they are still looked at. They will still get the benefit of the doubt over your average homeowner. I met this other homeowner when I was out in Oregon, and he went to war with Wells Fargo for doing pretty much a very similar thing to him that happened to Tom and Melinda. That is to say that they kind of, when the big national bank ended up taking it over from the buying the CD smaller bank, what they did is, they basically confuse the hell out of you, and then you end up in default even though you've been there for 20 years. So this one guy I met, he's a car auto mechanic. He'll be in a later installment of the series, and he went and he fought Wells Fargo on his own. This is a car mechanic, very smart guy, obviously, if he works with cars, but also was able to get some of the legal stuff. And he fought them in federal court, which is an hour and a half drive from his house, for stealing his trailer that he actually had for more than 20 years, where his business was too. And they ended up, he was doing pretty well. And the bank wound up flying in a huge legal team from Washington and from Seattle and Portland, and just burying him in paperwork and destroying him. And the point of this is that there's no one on your side. I was in covering this stuff in Boston, and there are at least some really great groups and, foreclosure eviction blockades. Everything is different out there. I'm not saying there aren't advocates. Certainly there are housing advocates, but these families are by and large in the middle of the woods. And it's truly not believable. And then of course, I won't get ahead of myself, but everything that we're getting into now, there's more to it. There's a reason that people want these lands. It's not just, I'm from Queens. It's not just somebody wanting your average, 1 acre, quarter acre plot in the suburbs or something. These are much more valuable lands. And that's what we're getting into now, is the big why.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. So we move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 4, which is kind of, you give a little bit of an overview of kind of Oregon expansion and something called the Rogue River Wars. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, I'll make this the quickest. This is the least popular chapter so far, but it's I'm so proud of it, and I know that I'm glad that it's there. It's one of the reasons I did this project independently, is because some of the national editors I've worked with on other projects, they didn't want to hear about the past and everything that's happening here. Obviously this is kind of like the history of this whole country, but really the history of Southwest Oregon, that the Wild West out there is some of the most brutal treatment of Native Americans in the entire country. The Americans who actually made it out there were insane. Keeping Indians as pets, and it's more than that. It's the specific land grabs. And I'll tell this one as quickly as possible, but basically it all started with, in addition to the land grab on natives, the federal government was fleeced from the get-go by some of the train companies, which weren't allowed to buy all the land next to their trains. They were granted every other piece in a checkerboard pattern, but they ended up getting the ones in between by getting drunks from the bars to buy those lands and sell them back. Anyway, it's just been one scam after another. So, when I find out about all this stuff that was happening in the 80s, the 90s, it goes back to the 1880s, the 1890s. So it's no surprise, but I think it's absolutely, critical and central to the story.